Good evening, dear listener. Come, settle in. Let the day slip away like leaves on a quiet stream. Imagine you are holding a warm cup of tea, the steam curling gently, the china warm against your palms. Allow your shoulders to soften, your breath to slow. Tonight we have a calm mystery for you, one that asks for nothing more than your peaceful attention. If these gentle tales bring you comfort, do consider subscribing for more soothing mysteries to accompany your evenings or ease you towards sleep. And now, let us begin. In the soft hush of an English afternoon, where the only sounds are bees in the lavender and the distant chime of church bells, there stands at the bottom of Miss Marple's garden an old oak barrel. It once belonged to Cooper the Cooper, the village barrel maker who passed away many years ago. Everyone calls it Cooper's barrel, a simple thing, weathered and harmless, used now only to catch rainwater for the roses. Yet lately, whenever Miss Marple passes it, she pauses, just for a moment, as though the barrel itself were trying to tell her something that ordinary eyes cannot see. Chapter 1: The Quiet Beginning. 1,000 Words. It was one of those perfect early September days in St. Mary Mead when the world seemed to pause and breathe more slowly. The sky was a pale, tender blue, streaked with the faintest wisps of cloud that promised nothing more than gentle shade. A light breeze carried the scent of late summer roses and freshly turned earth from the gardens along the lane. In the little house with the green-painted gate, Miss Jane Marple sat in her favorite armchair beside the sitting-room window. The chair had belonged to her mother, its chintz faded now to a soft rose and cream pattern that blended perfectly with the room's quiet colors. She was knitting. The needles moved with the steady, almost hypnotic rhythm that had accompanied so many of her thoughts over the years. The wool was a delicate lavender shade, chosen to match the shawl she had once made for her niece, though this one was intended for the church jumble sale in aid of the organ fund. Miss Marple liked useful knitting. It gave purpose to idle hands while the mind wandered where it pleased. Through the spotless window pane, she could see her garden in its usual orderly glory. The vegetable patch lay to the left. Rows of carrots, still crisp and orange beneath feathery tops. Runner beans climbing their poles in orderly obedience. A few late marrows swelling beneath broad leaves. Beyond them, the rose bed curved in a gentle arc. The blooms heavy and fragrant even now. Peace roses mostly, their pale gold petals edged with pink, and a scattering of crimson Mr. Lincoln for contrast. At the very far end of the garden, where the low stone wall met the lane, stood Cooper's barrel. It was an unremarkable object to most eyes. A plain oak barrel, perhaps 3 feet high, its staves weathered to a soft silver gray by rain and sun. The iron hoops had rusted in places to a warm brown, and the top had long since been removed so that it could catch rainwater. Everyone in the village knew it as Cooper's barrel, named for old Mr. Cooper, who had made it with his own hands more than 30 years earlier. Mr. Cooper had been the last proper Cooper in St. Mary Mead. In his day, he had supplied barrels to the cider press at Upper Pastures Farm, to the small brewery behind the Blue Boar, even to a few London wine merchants who valued his tight, clean joinery. He worked alone in a shed behind his cottage on the edge of the common, the air thick with the smell of shaved oak and hot iron. He never married, never had children, and when he died quietly in his sleep one winter night 15 years ago, his workshop was cleared, his tools sold at auction, and his few pieces of furniture distributed among neighbors who had been kind to him. The barrel had come to Miss Marple almost by chance. At the little sale in his cottage, she had noticed it standing in the yard, already half full of rainwater from a recent shower. It seemed too useful to be broken up for firewood, and she had always preferred soft water for her roses. "It will do nicely for the garden," she had said to the auctioneer, and no one else had bid against her. So home it came, trundled down the lane on a borrowed handcart, and placed at the bottom of her plot where it has remained ever since. Every morning, weather permitting, Miss Marple made the short walk down the garden path to check it. She carried a small tin cup, once used for measuring out plant food, and dipped it in to see how much had collected. After a good downpour, the barrel might hold 8 or 9 inches. In dry spells, it would dwindle to a mere puddle. Whatever was there she would pour carefully over the thirstiest plants, letting the soft water soak in slowly. Roses, she always said, preferred it to the hard tap water from the mains. It made the petals brighter, the leaves greener. It was one of those small, satisfying pieces of village knowledge passed down through generations. Lately, however, she had begun to linger beside the barrel a little longer than usual. She would stand there, secateurs in one hand or knitting still in the other, and simply look. Not at the roses, though they were lovely. Not at the sky or the wall or the lane beyond. At the barrel itself. There was nothing obviously wrong with it, no cracks, no leaning hoops, no sign of rot. The oak was sound, the staves still tight. Yet something about its presence felt different, too settled, perhaps, too quietly certain of its place. Miss Marple was not a fanciful woman. She believed in facts, in observation, in the small inconsistencies that most people overlooked because they were busy with larger matters. And this barrel, she thought as she turned back toward the house one bright morning, had begun to feel like one of those inconsistencies. Not alarming, not urgent, merely present, as though it were waiting for her to notice something she had not yet seen. She returned to her chair, picked up the lavender wool, and resumed knitting. The needles clicked softly. Outside, a blackbird sang from the apple tree, and somewhere down the lane children laughed on their way to school. The day moved forward in its gentle, unhurried way. Yet Miss Marple's mind stayed with the barrel. She remembered old Mr. Cooper, not well, for he had been a reserved man who kept to himself, but enough to recall his careful hands, the way he tested every stave for soundness, the small brass compass rose he sometimes etched inside his best work as a private mark of pride. She remembered, too, how he had once told her, quite casually over a cup of tea in her own kitchen, that a good barrel should last 3 lifetimes if treated with respect. 3 lifetimes. She smiled faintly to herself. Perhaps that was why it felt so settled. It had already seen more than one lifetime pass quietly by. The afternoon sun moved across the carpet in slow golden bars. Miss Marple knitted on. The shawl grew inch by inch. And at the bottom of the garden, Cooper's barrel waited, ordinary, useful, and, for the moment, entirely silent. Chapter 2. Something slightly unusual. 1,000 words. The following Tuesday dawned with the same gentle clarity that had settled over St. Mary Mead for days. Miss Marple rose at her usual hour, drew back the chintz curtains, and allowed the pale morning light to fill the sitting room. She made her tea, china, weak, with a single thin slice of lemon, and carried the tray to the small table by the window. From there she could watch the garden wake up. The first bees already busy among the lavender, the dew still glistening on the rose petals, and at the far end, Cooper's barrel standing exactly where it always had, dark against the soft gray of the stone wall. She had finished half her cup when the doorbell gave its soft, single chime. It was Mrs. Price from the post office, carrying a small brown paper parcel tied with string. "Morning, Miss Marple. Your wool arrived, 2 skeins of that lovely lavender you asked for, and they threw in an extra ball because the dye lot was short last time. Thought you might like it for the shawl." "How kind," Miss Marple murmured, taking the parcel and setting it beside her knitting basket. "Will you stay for a cup?" Mrs. Price never needed asking twice. She settled into the second armchair, accepted a cup of tea, and began the comfortable village chatter that always flowed between them. The new curate's sermon too long again, the price of butter creeping up, young Elsie at the bakery expecting her first in March. Miss Marple listened with her usual gentle attention, nodding at the right moments, asking the small questions that kept the conversation alive without effort. It was only when Mrs. Price rose to leave that her eye drifted toward the garden window. "That old barrel of yours still standing proud, I see," she said with a small laugh. 15 years and not a wobble. Old Cooper knew his trade, didn't he? Miss Marple smiled faintly. "He did. Very sound work." Mrs. Price paused at the door, hand on the latch. "Funny thing, though. Young Mr. Harrow, you know, The new man who's taken over the antique shop in Much Benham was asking after it the other day. Came in for stamps and started chatting about local history. Said he'd heard there was still an original Cooper barrel somewhere in the village. Wanted to know if anyone might be willing to part with one. I told him straight, no chance. Miss Marple's roses depend on that barrel, I said. He laughed, polite-like, but you could tell he was disappointed. Miss Marple tilted her head just a fraction. Did he indeed? Oh yes. Seemed quite keen. Said Cooper barrels are getting rare now. Most got broken up for furniture or firewood years ago. Collectors pay good money for the real thing, especially if it's got the maker's mark inside. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it did strike me as odd. Who'd want an old rainwater barrel for a collection? Mrs. Price gave another little laugh, shook her head at the foolishness of it, and let herself out. The door closed with its familiar soft click. Miss Marple remained where she was for several moments, teacup still warm in her hands. She looked again toward the garden. Cooper's barrel appeared exactly as it always had, plain, weathered, useful. Nothing about it suggested rarity or value. It caught rain. It watered roses. That was all. Yet the remark lingered. She set the cup down, rose slowly, and walked to the French windows that opened onto the garden. She stepped outside. The air was still cool, scented with damp earth and fading summer flowers. Her sensible shoes made no sound on the brick path as she made her way down toward the barrel. She stopped beside it as she had done so often lately. Up close, the oak staves showed every year of their age. Faint silvery cracks where the sun had dried the wood. Small patches of lichen near the base. The iron hoops pitted with rust but still holding firm. The open top revealed perhaps 4 inches of rainwater, enough after Sunday's shower, but not brimming as it sometimes was. She dipped her small tin cup, more from habit than necessity. The water was clear, cold, soft. She poured a little onto the nearest rose bush, watching it soak into the dark soil around the roots. Then she stood quite still, looking not at the roses now, but at the barrel itself. Why, she wondered, would an antique dealer from Much Benham, 15 miles away, take the trouble to inquire about a plain rainwater barrel in St. Mary Mead? There were surely dozens of old barrels scattered across the county, in farmyards, behind pubs, half buried in gardens. Most were far more decorative than this one. No carvings, no fancy banding, nothing to catch the eye. And yet he had asked specifically. Miss Marple turned the tin cup slowly in her hands. She thought of old Mr. Cooper again, quiet, careful, never one for show. He had always said a barrel's beauty was in its soundness, not its appearance. Let the work speak, he used to mutter when someone admired a polished example in his shed. Perhaps that was the point. Perhaps the very plainness was what made it special to someone who knew. She glanced up the path toward the house. The sitting room window reflected the sky like a mirror. Somewhere beyond it, the lavender wool waited, half knitted into a shawl. She returned indoors, closed the French windows gently, and resumed her place by the window. The needles took up their rhythm again, click, click, click. The shawl lengthened by another careful row, but her mind stayed in the garden. Outside, the bees continued their slow, contented work. A thrush landed briefly on the wall near the barrel, cocked its head, then flew away. The level of water in Cooper's barrel remained exactly as it had been when she left it, 4 inches, no more, no less. Yet Miss Marple felt, with the quiet certainty that came from long years of watching people and things, that something had shifted. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a small, almost imperceptible movement, like the first breath of wind before a change in the weather. She knitted on. The afternoon wore gently toward evening, and at the bottom of the garden, Cooper's barrel waited, still ordinary, still useful, but no longer quite so silent in her thoughts. Chapter 3 Gentle Observations 1000 words. The days that followed moved with the slow, unhurried certainty of early autumn in St. Mary Mead. Mornings grew a little crisper. The light turned a shade more golden as it slanted through the leaves. Miss Marple continued her routines without alteration, yet each small habit now carried an extra layer of quiet attention. On Wednesdays, she walked to the church as usual, carrying a trug of late dahlias and Michaelmas daisies for the altar vases. The vicar, Mr. Haydock, greeted her with his customary warmth and a slight worry about the state of the church roof. They discussed damp patches and the organ fund while she arranged the flowers in their tall brass pots. She listened, nodded, offered a few gentle suggestions about a possible grant from the diocese, and all the while her mind drifted, not far, only to the lane outside and the possibility that a certain antique dealer might pass by. He did not appear that day. Thursday brought tea at Gossington Hall with Mrs. Bantry. The two old friends sat in the long drawing room, windows open to the terrace, the scent of wood smoke drifting in from the bonfire where the gardener was burning prunings. Mrs. Bantry, ever fond of a good story, recounted the latest village gossip. The new postmistress's habit of reading postcards before delivery, the butcher's boy who had taken up bicycle racing, the surprising engagement of quiet Miss Lumley from the library. Miss Marple smiled and sipped her tea, Earl Grey this time, with milk, and let the conversation flow. At one point she asked, quite casually, whether Mrs. Bantry had heard anything of an antique shop newly opened in Much Benham. "Oh yes," Mrs. Bantry replied at once. "Young Mr. Harrow, quite charming, apparently. Specializes in English country pieces, farmhouse tables, Windsor chairs, the odd bit of treen. Dolly Dane was there last week and said he has an excellent eye." "Why?" "Thinking of selling that little oak settle of yours?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said mildly. "Merely curious. Someone mentioned he takes an interest in old barrel making." Mrs. Bantry raised an eyebrow. "Barrels? How peculiar. Though I suppose they count as treen in a broad sense. Cooperage is a dying art, after all." They spoke no more of it. Miss Marple returned home in the soft late afternoon light, pausing once or twice on the lane to admire someone's late-blooming clematis or a particularly fine display of Michaelmas daisies in a front garden. She passed the churchyard gate. No sign of Mr. Harrow. Friday morning she made her usual walk down the garden path with a tin cup in hand. The barrel held perhaps 3 inches of water now, less than after Sunday's rain, though there had been no heavy use of it. She dipped the cup, poured a little over the base of a thirsty peace rose, then stood quite still for several minutes, simply observing. The oak staves were as sound as ever. The iron hoops sat firmly. The lichen at the base had spread only a fraction since last year. Nothing had changed outwardly. Yet the water level had. She made no note of it aloud. She merely returned to the house, washed the cup, and resumed her knitting by the window. That afternoon she saw him. Mr. Harrow appeared at the far end of the lane, walking slowly, hands in the pockets of a well-cut tweed coat. He stopped near the lych gate of the church, looked about him with the air of someone admiring the view rather than searching for something specific, then continued past the row of cottages toward the common. He did not glance toward Miss Marple's garden, certainly not obviously, but she noticed the brief pause he made opposite the low stone wall where Cooper's barrel stood. He lingered perhaps 10 seconds longer than a casual passerby might. Then he walked on. Miss Marple continued knitting. The lavender shawl had grown to the point where she could begin decreasing for the shoulders. Click, click, click. The rhythm was soothing. Saturday she attended the Women's Institute meeting in the village hall. The topic was preserving fruit for winter, and Mrs. Dane demonstrated her method for bottling pears in honey syrup. Miss Marple listened attentively, asked 1 or 2 practical questions about sealing the jars, and afterward helped stack the chairs. As the ladies drifted out into the early evening, she fell into step beside Mrs. Dane. "You mentioned the other week that Mr. Harrow had been asking about old village trades," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Dane brightened. "Oh, yes. He came into the shop. Wanted to know if we had any old account books or ledgers from the Blue Boar Brewery. Said he was researching local cooperage for a book he's planning. Very polite young man. Asked specifically if anyone still had a Cooper barrel in use. I told him about yours, of course. Everyone knows Miss Marple's roses have the softest water in the village." Miss Marple smiled. "How kind of you to remember." They parted at the corner. Miss Marple walked home slowly, the evening air cool against her cheeks. That night, after drawing the curtains and setting the kettle for her bedtime cocoa, she returned once more to the garden window. The moon was up, a thin crescent shedding pale light across the lawn. Cooper's barrel stood dark and solid at the end of the path. She watched it for several minutes. Then she noticed something else. The water level, visible even in the moonlight, had dropped again. Not dramatically, perhaps half an inch since morning. Yet there had been no rain, no watering of roses, no one near the barrel that she had seen. She stood quite still, hands folded in front of her. People, she reflected, were creatures of habit. They moved in patterns, left traces, small, almost invisible traces, if one only knew where to look. Mr. Harrow had walked the lane twice that week. The water had lowered twice, in small, careful amounts. Someone who respected an old barrel would not smash it open. Someone who knew its value would lift out whatever needed lifting with care, replacing the water level as nearly as possible. She turned from the window. The house was quiet. The clock in the hall ticked softly toward 10. Miss Marple switched off the lamp, carried her cocoa upstairs, and prepared for bed. Tomorrow, she thought, she would look more closely. Not with haste, only with the calm, patient attention that had served her so well over the years. Outside, in the moonlit garden, Cooper's barrel waited, still ordinary to most eyes, but no longer quite so ordinary to hers. Chapter 4: Calm Contradiction. 1,000 words. Saturday morning arrived wrapped in a gentle mist that softened the edges of St. Mary Mead and made every leaf and petal glisten as though freshly washed. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and after a simple breakfast of toast and marmalade she put on her old gardening coat, took up her secateurs, and stepped out into the garden. The air was cool and clean, scented with wet earth and the faint sweetness of decaying leaves from the border. She walked slowly down the brick path, pausing now and then to snip a faded bloom or tie up a straggling tendril of clematis. The roses were still generous, though their petals had begun to take on the deeper tones of autumn. She worked methodically, her hand steady, her mind quiet. When she reached the far end of the garden, she stopped beside Cooper's barrel. She had come prepared, not with tools of detection, but simply with the small tin cup she always carried and a clean white handkerchief folded in her pocket. The barrel looked exactly as it had the day before, solid, weathered, unremarkable. The water inside caught the pale light filtering through the mist, reflecting the sky in a small, dark mirror. She dipped the cup carefully. The water came up shallow, barely an inch and a half now. Yesterday morning it had been nearer 3 inches. There had been no rain overnight, no watering done by her own hand, and certainly no heavy evaporation under the cool, damp conditions of the past few days. She straightened, thoughtful. Everyone in the village knew Cooper's barrel caught rainwater well. After even a moderate shower it would fill to a generous depth, enough to keep the roses content for a week or more. Mrs. Price had said as much only the previous Tuesday, laughing at the very idea of anyone wanting to take it away. Miss Marple's roses depend on it, she had declared with cheerful certainty. Yet here it stood, nearly empty. Miss Marple set the tin cup on the low stone wall and regarded the barrel more closely. She walked slowly around it, examining the staves from every angle. No cracks had appeared. No hoops had loosened. The oak remained tight, the joinery as precise as the day old Mr. Cooper had driven the last peg. Nothing suggested leakage or damage. She placed one hand lightly on the rim and leaned forward. The inside was dark, the water surface smooth except for a few stray leaves that had drifted in. She could see the faint curve of the staves descending into shadow. Nothing unusual met the eye. And yet the contradiction remained. If the barrel was doing what it had always done, simply standing open to the sky and collecting what fell, then the level should not have dropped so steadily, so precisely, in such small increments. Half an inch here, an inch there, always after a night when no one had been near the garden, or so it seemed. She took the handkerchief from her pocket and wiped her hands absently. Then, on an impulse born of long habit, she reached into the barrel with the cloth, pressing it gently against the inner face of one stave just below the waterline. The wood felt cool and slightly damp, as wood in constant contact with water should feel. No slime, no rot. She withdrew her hand and stood back. The obvious explanation that someone was quietly taking water from the barrel did not quite fit. Who in St. Mary Mead would steal rainwater in September, when taps ran freely and the wells were high? And why take it in such tiny amounts, night after night, when a single bucket would have served any ordinary purpose? No, that was not the shape of it. She considered the other possibility, that the barrel itself was at fault. Perhaps a hidden crack, a slow seep into the soil beneath. But she had checked the ground around the base many times. The earth remained firm, no dark stain of constant dampness, no mossy patch where water might pool unseen. The contradiction settled quietly in her mind, like a pebble dropped into still water. The barrel was known to be reliable. Everyone said so. Yet the evidence of her own eyes and her own tin cup showed it was no longer behaving as it should. She picked up the secateurs again and began dead-heading the nearest rose bush, snipping away spent blooms with small, precise cuts. Each snip was deliberate, calming. As she worked, she let the thought turn slowly, examining it from different angles the way one turns a piece of embroidery to see the pattern whole. Sometimes, she reflected, the most ordinary assumptions blind us longest. We see what we expect to see, a rainwater barrel, old and useful, nothing more. We name it Cooper's barrel and believe we have understood it completely. But names and habits can conceal as much as they reveal. She finished with the roses and walked back up the path toward the house. At the French windows she paused and looked back once more. The mist was lifting now, letting stronger sunlight touch the garden. Cooper's barrel stood in its accustomed place, dark against the wall, apparently unchanged. Yet the water inside it told a different story. Miss Marple stepped indoors, closed the windows gently, and hung her coat on the peg behind the door. She went to the kitchen, filled the kettle, and set it to boil. While she waited, she stood at the sink, looking out over the garden through the smaller window above the draining board. The kettle sang. She made tea, plain black this time, no lemon, and carried the cup to her armchair by the sitting-room window. She sat, cup warm in her hands, and watched the light strengthen across the lawn. The shawl waited on the side table, lavender wool neatly folded. She picked it up, found her place, and began to knit again. Click, click, click. The rhythm was steady, soothing. But her thoughts stayed with the barrel. The contradiction was small, almost invisible. Yet it was there. And once noticed, it refused to be ignored. She knew, with the quiet certainty that comes from years of careful watching, that the time had come to look more deeply, not with force or haste, but with the same patient attention one gives to a piece of fine lace when a thread has worked itself loose. Outside, the garden continued its gentle life. A robin landed briefly on the stone wall near the barrel, tilted its head, then flew away into the rising sun. And Cooper's barrel, so long accepted as ordinary, began at last to feel like something else entirely. Chapter 5, a detail revisited. 1,000 words. Sunday morning brought a change in the weather. Thin cloud cover that filtered the sunlight into a soft, even glow across St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple attended early service at the church, then returned home by way of the lane rather than the footpath through the meadows. She walked slowly, secateurs in one pocket, small notebook and pencil in the other, tools she carried more from habit than any immediate plan. At home she changed into her gardening skirt and cardigan, made a fresh pot of tea, and carried a tray to the small wrought iron table beneath the apple tree. From there the entire garden lay before her, peaceful and familiar. She poured tea, added milk, and sat for a while simply looking. Her gaze settled, as it so often did now, on Cooper's barrel. The water level had dropped again overnight, barely half an inch this time, but enough to confirm the pattern. No rain had fallen. No one had passed through the garden gate after dusk. Yet the barrel continued its quiet, steady emptying. Miss Marple set her cup down and walked down the path once more. This time she approached the barrel with deliberate care. She had brought no mirror, no gloves, only the quiet determination to see what she had overlooked before. She circled it slowly, studying the staves from every angle in the gentle daylight. The oak was still sound, the hoop secure. Nothing had altered outwardly since Saturday. She stopped at the open top and leaned forward. The inside rim of the barrel, just below the lip where rainwater would normally lap against the wood when full, had always appeared dark and unremarkable. Moss or algae sometimes gathered there in damp seasons, but old Cooper had treated his barrels well. The interior was remarkably clean for something exposed to the weather for so many years. Yet today, with the water so low, something caught her eye. Faint scratches, old, deliberate, almost invisible unless one knew precisely where to look. Not random wear from wind or leaves. They formed a small, repeated pattern. A tiny compass rose, no larger than a sixpence, etched into the oak with a fine point. She had seen that mark before, years ago, when old Mr. Cooper had once shown her the inside of a half-finished barrel in his shed. A private signature, he had said then, almost shyly, "Only on my best work. No one needs to see it but me." Miss Marple reached into her cardigan pocket for the small magnifying glass she sometimes used for reading fine print in seed catalogs. She held it above the rim and angled it to catch the light. The compass rose was clear now, 8 delicate points radiating from a center dot. Beneath it, almost hidden by shadow, a thin dark line that did not belong to the wood grain. She straightened, thoughtful. The barrel had been nearly full when she first noticed the irregularities. Only when the level fell did this small detail become visible. Someone very careful, had been reaching inside repeatedly, lifting something out, then replacing it, each time lowering the water just enough to allow access without spilling or drawing attention. She placed the magnifying glass away and considered the barrel again. Old Cooper had been a man of method. If he had hidden anything of value, he would have chosen a place both secure and subtle, not smashed into a stave or buried beneath a base that would have risked damage or discovery. No. Something wedged between the tight joinery, just below the normal waterline, protected by the very rainwater it was meant to collect. Miss Marple fetched a thin wooden ruler from the potting shed, nothing metal that might scratch the oak, and returned to the barrel. She lowered the ruler gently inside, pressing it flat against one of the inner staves near the compass mark. At first nothing. Then a faint resistance. She adjusted the angle, slid the ruler carefully downward. There, a small, flat object, no thicker than a few sheets of paper, caught between 2 staves where the wood had been ever so slightly eased apart during construction. The gap was so fine it would have been invisible when the barrel was full. With infinite patience, she worked the ruler beneath the packet and lifted it slowly upward. It came free with almost no sound, a thin, oiled cloth bundle, no larger than a gentleman's handkerchief, damp but intact. She carried it carefully to the table beneath the apple tree and laid it on a clean tea towel she had brought from the house. The cloth was dark green, tied with fine twine. She untied the knot, old and stiff but yielding, and unfolded the layers. Inside lay several yellow documents, bearer bonds from the old Great Western and Southern Railway Company, dated 1928, each with a face value that, even to her untrained eye, seemed considerable. Folded beneath them was a single sheet of note paper, the ink faded but legible. It was a letter, dated October 15, 1945, from a firm of London solicitors to Mr. Harold Cooper of St. Mary Mead. Dear Mr. Cooper, following your instructions, we have arranged the purchase of the unclosed bearer bonds in your name. As discussed, these are unregistered securities and may be redeemed by the holder without further proof of ownership. We understand your wish for discretion. Should you require our services in the future, please do not hesitate to write. Yours faithfully, J.R. Ellison, partner. Ellison, Grayson and Partners. Miss Marple read the letter twice, then refolded it gently. Old Mr. Cooper had never spoken of wealth. He had lived simply, worked steadily, died quietly. Yet here was evidence of careful provision, money set aside, hidden inside the finest barrel he ever made, placed where it would be safe from prying eyes and greedy hands. And someone had recently discovered, or suspected, the secret. Mr. Harrow's interest now made perfect sense. Not greed, perhaps, but professional curiosity. A collector who knew the old Cooper's reputation, who had heard rumors of a lost Cooper piece that might contain more than oak and iron. The water level had dropped because the packet had been lifted out, checked, perhaps photographed, then returned, each time with care not to damage the wood or arouse suspicion. Miss Marple sat back in the chair, hands folded in her lap. The barrel had guarded its secret faithfully for decades. Only now, with the water low and the mark visible, had the truth begun to emerge. She rewrapped the packet exactly as she had found it, tied the twine with the same careful knot, and carried it back to the barrel. She lowered it gently into place, wedging it once more between the staves. Then she dipped a watering can from the shed and restored the level to what it had been before the latest drop, enough to cover the hiding place again, but not so much as to draw comment. She returned to the house, washed her hands, and resumed her place by the sitting-room window. The lavender shawl waited. She picked up the needles. Click, click, click. The pattern was clearer now. The mystery no longer lay in what the barrel was, but in what it had quietly held all these years. And soon, she thought, it would be time to explain, calmly, without fuss, to the one person best placed to see that everything was set right. Outside, a light breeze moved through the garden. The roses nodded gently. Cooper's barrel stood once more as it always had, ordinary, useful, and now, at last, understood. Chapter 6, Quiet Explanation. 1,000 words. That same Sunday evening, as the light began to fade into a soft lavender dusk, Miss Marple telephoned Inspector Craddock at his home in Much Benham. She spoke with her usual gentle courtesy, apologizing for disturbing him after hours, and asked whether he might find time to call the following afternoon for a cup of tea. He agreed at once. He had known Miss Marple long enough to recognize when a cup of tea carried more than social intent. Monday arrived mild and still. Miss Marple spent the morning in her accustomed way. A little light dusting, a walk to the village shop for milk and a tin of biscuits, then back to the sitting room to knit another few rows of the lavender shawl. The packet from the barrel rested now on the small rosewood table beside her chair, still wrapped in its green oiled cloth, the twine neatly retied. At 3:30 the doorbell chimed. Inspector Craddock, now Chief Inspector, though to Miss Marple he would always be the young man who once listened so patiently to her observations, stood on the step in a plain gray overcoat, hat in hand. "Do come in, Inspector," she said warmly. "The kettle is just on the boil." They settled in the sitting room. Miss Marple poured tea, china again, with thin slices of lemon, and offered him a shortbread biscuit. For a few minutes they spoke of ordinary things. The new housing estate on the edge of the village, the mildness of the autumn, the state of the cricket pitch after last week's rain. Then, quite naturally, she turned the conversation. "I wonder, Inspector, if you would be so kind as to look at something for me." She lifted the small packet from the table and placed it before him. Craddock opened the cloth carefully, examined the bearer bonds, then unfolded the solicitor's letter. He read it twice in silence, his expression thoughtful but unhurried. "These are quite valuable now," he said at last. "The Great Western and Southern Line was wound up years ago, but a recent High Court ruling declared many of these old bearer securities still redeemable by the current holder. No registration needed, just presentation. Someone with knowledge of railway history could have spotted the potential." Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly so." She began to explain, speaking in her quiet, measured way, as though recounting a simple piece of village news rather than unraveling a long-hidden secret. "Old Mr. Cooper was never a man for display," she said. He lived plainly, saved carefully, and when he had a little windfall, perhaps from a good year of cider barrel orders, he invested it quietly. These bonds were bought in 1928, hidden away in 1945 after the war, when he must have felt the world uncertain again. He placed them inside his finest barrel, the one he knew would be taken by someone who valued usefulness over ornament. He even mentioned me in passing to the auctioneer, knowing my roses would keep it outside, full of water, safe from curious hands. Craddock listened without interruption. The water level began to drop. She continued, not from evaporation or theft in the ordinary sense, but because someone was reaching in, very carefully, lifting the packet out, examining it, then replacing it. Each time the level fell just enough to allow access without spilling. Whoever it was respected the barrel. They did not force the staves or break the hoops. That told me a great deal. She paused to refill his cup. Mr. Harrow, the antique dealer from Much Benham, had been asking after Cooper barrels. Not out of greed, I think, but professional interest. Word must have reached him, perhaps through an old auction catalog or a solicitor's diary that surfaced recently, that one of Cooper's pieces might contain something more than oak. He came to the village twice last week, walked past the garden, paused long enough to look, but never approached directly. An honest man, I believe, hoping to purchase the barrel openly if it proved to be the right one. Craddock set his cup down. And the dark evidence in the title everyone keeps mentioning? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Not dark in the sinister sense, Inspector. Merely hidden. Evidence of quiet, thoughtful provision that Mr. Cooper made for a future he would never see. The barrel guarded it faithfully, through rain and sun, through 15 years of being called ordinary, until the moment arrived when the secret needed to be understood. She gestured toward the packet. I have left everything exactly as it was. The bonds are still wedged where he placed them. I restored the water level this morning so that nothing appears disturbed. What happens next must be done properly, through the proper channels, so that any legitimate claimant may come forward without difficulty. Craddock regarded her for a long moment. You could have kept this to yourself, Miss Marple. No one would have known. She shook her head gently. That would not have been right. Mr. Cooper trusted the barrel to keep his secret safe, not to keep it forever hidden from those who might have a claim. Besides, she added with the smallest of smiles, secrets kept too long sometimes weigh more heavily than we realize. They sat in companionable silence for a while. Outside, the garden lay peaceful in the late afternoon light. A blackbird sang from the apple tree. Somewhere down the lane a bicycle bell rang once, then faded. Craddock rose at last. I'll take the matter in hand myself, discreetly. We'll trace any distant relatives or claimants through the solicitors named in the letter. If Mr. Harrow is indeed acting in good faith, he may even be able to help identify the proper heirs. No fuss, no publicity. Miss Marple walked him to the door. Thank you, Inspector. And do come again soon, for tea, without any mysteries at all. He smiled. I should like that. When he had gone, she returned to her chair, picked up the knitting needles, and resumed the lavender shawl. Click, click, click. The pattern was complete now. Every small detail, the water level, the compass rose, the careful visitor, the hidden packet, had found its place. No violence had been done, no voices raised. Only quiet observation, patient reasoning, and a gentle insistence that things be set right. The house settled into evening quiet. The clock ticked softly. Outside, Cooper's barrel stood once more full of rainwater, its secret no longer a burden, but a story understood at last. Miss Marple knitted on, content. Chapter 7, Peaceful Resolution, 1,000 words. The weeks that followed passed with the gentle inevitability of an English autumn turning toward winter. Leaves drifted slowly from the apple tree onto the lawn, carpeting the garden path in shades of gold and russet. The roses held on bravely for a time, then one by one released their last petals to the soft earth. Miss Marple continued her daily walks down the path, tin cup in hand, checking the level in Cooper's barrel as she always had. Inspector Craddock kept his word. He moved quietly, without fanfare. Through the London solicitors named in the old letter, he traced the chain of ownership and discovered a distant cousin, a quiet widow named Mrs. Eleanor Finch, living in a small flat in Bath. She was the granddaughter of Mr. Cooper's elder sister, the only living relative with any claim. Mrs. Finch had never known of the bonds. She remembered her great-uncle only as the kind old man who once sent her a wooden spinning top for her 8th birthday. When the matter was explained to her, gently over tea in her own sitting room, she listened in quiet astonishment. The sum, though modest by modern standards, would make a real difference. Enough to repair the leaking roof of her flat, to replace the worn armchair that had belonged to her late husband, perhaps even to take a short holiday by the sea each summer. She accepted the news without greed or disbelief, only with a soft, grateful wonder that something so long forgotten could still reach across the years to help her. Mr. Harrow, when approached by Craddock, proved exactly as Miss Marple had suspected, an honest dealer with a genuine passion for English country craftsmanship. He had heard whispers of a Cooper secret through an old auction catalogue that mentioned a Cooper's private mark on certain pieces. He had hoped, if the barrel in St. Mary Mead proved to be the one, to purchase it fairly and then, with the owner's permission, recover whatever might be hidden inside for the proper heirs. He had never intended to take without asking. In the end, he was invited to tea at Miss Marple's. They sat in the garden on a mild November afternoon, rugs over their knees, the kettle singing on a small spirit stove. Mr. Harrow examined the barrel with respectful hands, tracing the faint compass rose inside the rim and nodding slowly. "It's one of his finest," he said quietly. "The joinery is perfect. You can feel the care he took." Miss Marple poured tea and passed him a cup. He was a careful man in all things. Mr. Harrow purchased a different Cooper barrel from a farm near Gloucester, smaller, plainer, but still bearing the private mark. He left St. Mary Mead content, promising to send Miss Marple a photograph of the piece when it was restored. The bearer bonds were redeemed through proper channels. The money reached Mrs. Finch in due course. She wrote Miss Marple a short, handwritten note of thanks, simple words on cream notepaper, expressing gratitude not only for the inheritance but for the kindness that had brought it to light. Miss Marple kept the note in her writing desk, beside the lavender shawl now finished and folded neatly, ready for the church jumble sale. And Cooper's barrel remained exactly where it had always stood. Miss Marple had the inner rim gently cleaned one dry afternoon, only the dust of years removed, nothing more, and then treated the exposed oak with a light coat of boiled linseed oil to preserve the compass rose. She continued to catch rainwater for her roses. The level rose and fell with the weather as it always had, no longer dropping mysteriously in the night. The barrel was once again simply what it appeared to be, an old, useful rainwater collector at the bottom of a quiet garden. Sometimes, when the light was right and the garden still, she would pause beside it on her morning walk, rest one hand lightly on the weathered rim, and smile the smallest of smiles. It was not sentimentality. It was recognition of a secret well kept, of a life lived with quiet integrity, of order restored without noise or drama. The village carried on in its gentle rhythm. The church bells rang for evensong. The blackbird returned to the apple tree each evening to sing. Children walked home from school laughing, their breath visible in the crisp air. Mrs. Price continued to bring parcels of wool and village news. Mrs. Bantry invited Miss Marple to tea at Gossington Hall, and they spoke of books and gardens and the small happenings of daily life. Nothing had changed outwardly, yet everything felt subtly lighter, as though a small weight long carried had been set down at last. One late November evening, as the first frost silvered the lawn, Miss Marple drew the curtains against the early dark, lit the fire in the sitting room, and settled into her armchair with a fresh pot of tea and the last of the shortbread biscuits. The lavender shawl lay across her knees, soft and warm. Outside, the garden lay peaceful under the rising moon. She looked toward the window, though she could see little beyond her own reflection now. Cooper's barrel mystery had never truly been a mystery of darkness. The dark evidence had been nothing sinister, only hidden value, patient provision, a quiet act of care that had waited decades to be understood. The barrel had held its trust faithfully until the moment was right. And now that moment had passed, leaving only calm, only order, only the gentle satisfaction of things rightly concluded. Miss Marple sipped her tea slowly. The fire crackled softly. The clock in the hall ticked toward bedtime. She set the cup down, picked up her knitting needles once more, not for the shawl this time, but for a new piece, something small and useful for the winter bazaar. Click, click, click. The sound filled the room like a lullaby. Dear listener, the garden sleeps now. The roses rest beneath their frost-kissed leaves. The barrel stands steady, full of rainwater once more, waiting for the next gentle shower. All is quiet in St. Mary Mead. All is well. Rest now. Let the peace of this small village wrap around you like the softest wool. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Dream gently of gardens and quiet secrets kept with care. Good night. Chapter 8, A Gentle Epilogue. 1,000 words. Winter settled over St. Mary Mead like a soft blanket of frost and quiet days. The garden paths grew crisp underfoot. The roses retreated into thorny dormancy, and the low stone wall at the bottom of Miss Marple's plot wore a thin edging of white each morning. Yet Cooper's barrel stood unchanged, its oak staves dark against the pale sky, the iron hoops catching the weak sunlight in faint gleams, the rainwater inside now a still, dark mirror that reflected bare branches and passing clouds. Miss Marple no longer paused beside it with quite the same intent curiosity. The mystery had unfolded, been understood, and gently set aside, as one folds away a completed piece of embroidery. She still checked the level each day, still dipped the tin cup to water the few hardy plants that remained green through the cold, herbs mostly, and a stubborn clump of winter jasmine climbing the wall. The ritual continued because it was comforting, not because anything remained hidden. One December afternoon, when the light was already fading by 3 o'clock, a small parcel arrived at the green-painted gate. The postmark was Bath. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper and tied with narrow ribbon, lay a delicate wooden spinning top, hand-turned oak, polished to a warm glow, with a tiny compass rose etched into the rounded top. A note accompanied it, written in Mrs. Finch's careful hand. Dear Miss Marple, I thought you might like to have this. It was among my great-uncle's things that came to me after everything was settled. The solicitor said it was one of the few personal items he kept. I have no children to pass it to, and it seems right that it should stay in St. Mary Mead with someone who understood him so well. Thank you again for everything. With warmest regards, Eleanor Finch. Miss Marple held the top in her palm, turning it slowly. The wood felt smooth, familiar, as though old Mr. Cooper's careful hands had only just set it down. She placed it on the mantelpiece beside the clock, where it caught the firelight each evening and spun a small, contented shadow across the wall when she gave it a gentle twist. The village moved forward in its timeless way. Christmas came with carol singers at the door, a small tree in the sitting room decorated with silver paper chains and a single string of fairy lights. Miss Marple baked mince pies as always, shared them with neighbors, and attended the midnight service where the church smelled of holly and candle wax. She spoke no more of barrels or hidden papers. There was no need. The story had ended quietly, as good stories often do. In the new year, when the first snowdrops pushed through the frozen soil near the roses, Mr. Harrow sent a postcard from Gloucester, a photograph of the Cooper barrel he had acquired. It stood in his workshop window, sunlight falling across its staves, the private mark just visible inside the rim. On the back he had written, "Restored and cherished. No secrets this time, only good oak. With thanks, R. Harrow." Miss Marple pinned the card to the corkboard in the kitchen, beside recipes and reminders for the Women's Institute meetings. Spring arrived slowly, as it does in England, first the snowdrops, then crocuses, then daffodils nodding along the path. The roses began to leaf out, green and promising. Miss Marple resumed her full gardening rounds, pruning, tying, feeding the soil with compost she had turned herself. Cooper's barrel caught the April showers, filling steadily once more. The water level rose and fell with the weather, predictable again, ordinary again. Yet on certain quiet mornings, when the village still slept and the only sound was a distant blackbird, Miss Marple would walk down the path, pause beside the barrel, and rest her hand on the rim. Not to check for secrets, there were none left, but to acknowledge the small piece of history that had rested there so long. A man's careful life, a hidden hope, a trust kept through rain and drought. It reminded her gently that the most ordinary things often carry the deepest meaning if one only waits long enough to see. One such morning in late April she returned to the house with damp shoes and a handful of early violets picked from the border. She arranged them in a small glass vase on the sitting room table, beside the spinning top and the Gloucester postcard. Then she sat in her armchair, picked up her knitting, a new shawl in soft gray wool this time, and began again. Click, click, click. The needles moved steadily. Outside, the garden breathed with the new season. Bees hummed in the awakening lavender. The church bells chimed the hour. All was peaceful. All was as it should be. And at the bottom of the garden, Cooper's barrel stood full and content, its rainwater clear, its secret told, its purpose fulfilled, not as a vessel of mystery any longer, but as a quiet guardian of memory in a world that still values the small, steady things. Dear listener, the tale is complete. The village sleeps on underchanging skies. Let the gentle rhythm of St. Mary Mead carry you now. Soft bells, soft rain, soft endings. Rest deeply. Dream of gardens where secrets bloom only to bring kindness, where ordinary barrels hold extraordinary care. Sleep well, wrapped in calm. Chapter 9, The Last Whisper of the Barrel. 1,000 words. Time moved on in St. Mary Mead the way it always had, slowly, kindly, without hurry or regret. Another summer arrived, warmer than the last, with long golden evenings and the scent of honeysuckle drifting over garden walls. Miss Marple's roses bloomed more lavishly than ever, as though grateful for the soft rainwater that had never failed them. Cooper's barrel stood faithfully at the bottom of the path, its oak staves now a deeper silver gray, the iron hoops darkened by another year of gentle weathering. She was 91 now, though she never spoke of age. Her steps were a little slower down the brick path, her hands a fraction less steady when she dipped the tin cup, but her eyes remained clear and observant. Each morning she made the short journey, past the vegetables, past the climbing clematis, past the lavender bed where bees still hummed their endless summer song, and checked the barrel as she had done for decades. The level rose after rain, fell in dry spells. Nothing mysterious remained. No hidden packets, no faint compass roses waiting to be discovered. Only water, only wood, only the quiet companionship of an object that had outlived its maker and its secret. One July afternoon, when the sun hung low and heavy, a young woman appeared at the green-painted gate. She carried a small notebook and wore sensible walking shoes. Her hair was tied back in a loose knot, and she looked about her with the careful interest of someone who had come a long way to see something particular. Miss Marple, sitting beneath the apple tree with her knitting, noticed her at once. The visitor introduced herself as Clara Finch, M.R.S., Eleanor Finch's granddaughter, now 24, studying local history at university. She had heard the story from her grandmother, not as gossip but as family lore. The quiet great-great-uncle who made barrels, the unexpected inheritance, the kind lady in St. Mary Mead who had made sure everything was done properly. "I didn't come to disturb you," Clara said softly, accepting the offered chair and a glass of elderflower cordial. "I only wanted to see it. The barrel. If that's all right." Miss Marple smiled. "Of course, my dear. It's only an old barrel, after all." They walked together down the path. Clara moved slowly, matching Miss Marple's pace without seeming to. When they reached the end of the garden, Clara stopped and looked at Cooper's barrel for a long moment. "It's smaller than I imagined," she said at last. "And yet it feels important." Miss Marple rested one hand on the rim. It was important to him. That's enough. Clara opened her notebook, not to write but to show a single photograph, old, creased, taken in the 1940s. A younger Harold Cooper stood outside his shed, apron on, holding a half-finished barrel. His face was serious, but there was pride in the set of his shoulders. "My grandmother kept this," Clara explained. She said he never smiled for cameras, but he smiled when he worked. They stood in silence for a while. A light breeze moved through the roses, carrying their scent toward the two women. Somewhere down the lane a child laughed. Church bells began to chime the hour. Clara closed the notebook. "I'm writing a small paper for my course about disappearing crafts. Cooperage, mostly. I wanted to mention him. Not the money or the bonds, just the work, the care he took." Miss Marple nodded. "That would please him, I think." Before she left, Clara asked if she might take one photograph of the barrel itself. Nothing dramatic, just as it stood, open to the sky, full of rainwater. Miss Marple agreed. The shutter clicked once, softly. Clara thanked her again, promised to send a copy of the finished paper, and walked back up the path. At the gate she turned once and waved. Miss Marple raised a hand in return, then watched until the young woman disappeared around the bend in the lane. That evening Miss Marple sat by the open French windows, knitting a pair of soft gray mittens for the church Christmas sale, though Christmas was still months away. The spinning top rested on the mantelpiece. The Gloucester postcard remained pinned in the kitchen. Everything was in its place. Outside, the garden darkened slowly. The first stars appeared above the stone wall. Cooper's barrel stood dark and solid, its open top catching the last of the twilight like a quiet eye. Miss Marple looked toward it one final time that day. No mystery lingered now. No contradiction waited to be resolved. Only a small, enduring object that had done exactly what it was meant to do. Hold water for roses, hold a secret for a time, hold memory for those who came after. She finished the row of knitting, set the needles aside, and drew the curtains against the cooling night. The house settled into silence. The clock ticked. The fire in the grate gave one last soft pop. Dear listener, this is where the story rests at last. The barrel stands. The roses bloom and fade in their season. Young people come looking for old stories, and sometimes they find them, not in drama or revelation, but in the simple fact that someone once cared enough to make something well, to hide something safely, to trust that kindness would find its way. Let that quiet certainty stay with you now. Breathe slowly. Let the soft sounds of an English village at night, the distant owl, the rustle of leaves, the faint chime of bells, carry you toward sleep. All is calm. All is remembered. All is well. Chapter 10. The barrel remains. 1,000 words. Years turned softly in St. Mary Mead, each one folding quietly into the next like pages in an old, well-loved book. The seasons came and went with their familiar rhythm. Spring daffodils, summer roses, autumn bonfires, winter frost that turned the garden path into a silver ribbon under moonlight. Miss Marple's little house with the green gate stood unchanged, curtains drawn at dusk, chimney smoking gently on cold evenings, the scent of tea and shortbread drifting from the kitchen window. She was gone now. Not suddenly, not with drama. One peaceful March morning, after a night of soft rain that filled Cooper's barrel to the brim, she simply did not wake. The doctor said it was the heart giving way at last, old, tired, but never troubled. The village mourned in its understated way. A few more flowers on the church altar, a quiet gathering in the hall after the service, neighbors sharing memories over cups of tea. They spoke of her kindness, her sharp eyes, the way she always seemed to know things before anyone else did. The house passed to a distant niece who lived in London and had no wish to keep it. It was sold to a young family, 2 small children, a dog, a garden that needed tending. They moved in during early summer. voices and laughter filling rooms that had known only quiet for so long. The new owners were kind people. They kept the apple tree, replanted the lavender border, and left the old oak barrel exactly where it had always stood. They called it the rainwater barrel, never knowing its full name or its history. To the children, it was simply the big bucket at the end, a place to float leaf boats after rain or watch tadpoles appear in spring when a stray frog found its way inside. The mother used the water for her window boxes. The father once thought of moving it closer to the house but decided against it. "It looks right where it is," he said, and so it stayed. Clara Finch's university paper was published in a small journal of local history. It included the photograph she had taken that July afternoon. Cooper's barrel in soft sunlight, roses blooming behind it, the open top dark with water. The article spoke of Harold Cooper's craftsmanship, his private compass rose, the way certain objects become more than themselves when cared for over decades. A few copies reached St. Mary Mead. One found its way into the village library, where it sat on a shelf beside books of garden lore and old ordnance survey maps. Occasionally, a visitor to the church would wander down the lane, notebook in hand, and pause at the low stone wall to look at the barrel. They would read the brief plaque the Women's Institute had placed there after Miss Marple's passing, a small brass square screwed neatly to the wall. Cooper's barrel, made by Harold Cooper, Cooper of this parish, kept for roses by Jane Marple. A good thing should last 3 lifetimes. 1895 to 1982. No one spoke of hidden bonds or solicitors' letters anymore. That part of the story had faded into family anecdote, told only at Christmas when Mrs. Finch's descendants gathered. What remained was simpler: an old barrel, a garden, a woman who noticed things. One late autumn evening, years after the house had changed hands, the youngest child, now 7, ran down the path with a torch after supper. Rain had fallen all afternoon. The barrel was full to overflowing, water gleaming black under the beam of light. The boy leaned over the rim, watching ripples spread from a falling leaf. "Mum says this barrel is older than Granny," he called back toward the lit windows. His mother appeared at the French doors, drying her hands on a tea towel. "Older than great-granny, probably," she replied. "It's been here a very long time." The boy dipped his fingers into the cold water, then wiped them on his jumper. "Do you think it remembers everything?" His mother smiled in the doorway, the light behind her making a soft halo. "Perhaps it does, in its own way. Things that stay in one place a long time. They hold memories the way wood holds water. Quietly, without fuss." The boy nodded solemnly, as children do when they sense something important, but do not yet have words for it. He switched off the torch and ran back up the path, leaving the garden to darkness and the steady drip of leftover rain from the eaves. Inside the barrel, the water settled again, still and clear. Outside, the night deepened. Stars appeared above the stone wall. An owl called once from the common. The roses slept beneath their pruning, dreaming of next summer's bloom. And Cooper's barrel remained, not as a mystery, not as evidence of anything hidden or dark, only as itself. Oak staves shaped by careful hands, iron hoops rusted to a gentle brown, rainwater collected year after year for thirsty roots. A small, steady presence at the end of a garden path, outliving questions and answers alike. Dear listener, this is the final place the story comes to rest. No more chapters wait. No more secrets stir beneath the surface. Only quiet continuity, the soft sound of water when rain falls, the faint creak of wood in frost, the knowledge that some things endure not because they are grand, but because they are loved enough to be left alone. Let that peace enter you now. Breathe in the scent of damp earth and fading leaves. Listen to the hush that follows a long tale told gently. Feel your own breath slow, your body soften against the pillow. The garden sleeps. The barrel waits. All is calm. Sleep well, dear one. Dream, if you dream at all, of quiet places where ordinary things keep their promises without ever needing to speak.